We are live here.
I'm audible, right?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, based on which time zone you are located in. My name is Piyush, and today I am happy to announce the launch of this webinar series, IITB Alum Talks, initiated by IIT Bombay Alumni Association Hyderabad chapter. Today's webinar is the first event in the series, and we hope to come up with more in the future. Today, our speaker is Dr. Ajay Kolarkar, and he will be talking on the interesting topic of design thinking, a novel approach to understand and solve problems. Dr. Ajay is an IIT Bombay 2005 pass out and has over 24 years of experience in product development, project management, and business consulting. Ajay has co-authored 5 US patents and is also a recipient of the prestigious Chevening Rolls-Royce scholarship granted by the British government. So walking through his experience, I'm sure it will be a very interesting topic to hear from him today. Before we proceed to the talk, just a few notes on the logistic points. Since it is a limited 1-hour session today, to save interruptions in between, we will be muting all the participants. Participants can chat or type in the chat box any questions they might have or might get during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, based on the available time, we will pick few questions and request Dr. Ajay to answer. For remaining questions, we will download them and get them answered by Dr. Ajay offline and send to all participants on their email address. Now, without much further ado, I welcome Dr. Ajay Kolarkar for the talk. Ajay, over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Piyush. Thank you so much for inviting me for your introductory session. It's a privilege for me to be able to speak to the alumni of IITB. And it actually gives me a little bit of a jitters because I'm maybe speaking to people who already well accomplished and have achieved a lot. And I'm going to be presenting something that I've been working with for the last few years. So there are butterflies in my stomach even as I speak to you all. So, but thank you so much for the privilege, and it's a pleasure to be able to engage with all of you today. I'm going to start sharing my presentation. Just someone let me know if you can see the screen.
Yeah, we are able to see.
Thank you. So I think the topic that we discussed, Piyush and I discussed, is design thinking, and we deliberated a little bit about what we should do with it and all that. So he said, we'd like to make it a little bit more generic in terms of how it could be used for understanding and solving problems. And I think I'm going to pitch at that kind of level. But I also want to be able to give some kind of an overview of what design thinking is all about. I'm pretty sure the colleagues that have joined today already have heard of design thinking as an approach or a phenomenon or a process. It's there in a lot of business language that we hear today, and therefore I don't think it's a new term. I don't even think that there is anything new that you'll probably not have already read about in the way that the presentation is created. But I'm making it. I'm pitching it at the most common fundamental level in terms of trying to explain the concept of design thinking more than anything else. And so that's where I want to be able to do that. But before we get started, here are a few problems that are mundane, are day-to-day, and I wonder whether design thinking can solve these problems. So for example, you are waiting on the 11th floor of a building, and there are multiple elevators in that building, and each of these elevators has 2 buttons, one which points up or an up arrow, and one which point downwards. Okay, and let's assume that you are trying to wait, and there are several other people who are also waiting along with you. Which button would you press if you wanted to go down? And the reason I'm asking this question is, have you noticed people who want to go up press the down button and people who want to go down press the up button? not really realizing what they're doing. And then what happens evidently is that a completely packed elevator stops at your floor with no more space to get in, but it's either going up or going down, whichever way you want to go, but there is no space because you can't get into that. And then the elevator just closes and goes down, and you have to press that button all over again. In the same situation, there are multiple elevators on the same floor, and sometimes you need to press 2 different buttons or 3 different buttons to call each of those elevators to that floor. In some cases now, people have solved that problem, so to say, where all of these are now available using just one single button. One press of a button makes all the elevators to come to that floor. But this is a problem that is still something that needs to be solved. How do I know which button to press if I want to go down? And how do I know which button to press if I want to go up without really creating any inconvenience for others? The other thing that you probably would have come across is if you ever stayed in a hotel and tried to make tea in the morning, they will give you a sachet of, let's say, a milk powder. And it's really difficult to kind of open that milk powder without really spilling some of the contents outside, because it's packed, although they provide a notch for you to tear it. But even as you tear it, some of that kind of powder spills over and it creates a mess. It's also sticky. So that's a problem that still requires solving. I don't know whether people have solved that already. The colors of buttons that you see on website, I use a very popular banking site, and whenever I make some payments, I get 3 options of buttons. I mean, 3 options to kind of do. All of them are in the same color. And at least twice I have clicked the wrong button because I was in a hurry and didn't read what was the text on that button. And so this is another challenge kind of a thing. A lot of people you will have seen at retail counters or retail outlets trying to open packed pieces of stuff just to look what is there inside, because they are not able to figure out what is going on. And sometimes it's a challenge because that packed piece can then, that unpacked piece can never be packed once again. And therefore the retailer has to either sell it at a discount or in some way prevent people from opening such packs. So this and one more interesting stuff. If you ever got a bottle of, let's say, I think some kind of liquid or some kind of something that can be very easily spilled, it has a plastic wrapper or a plastic seal on top of it, which you are supposed to open and then use the content. It's always very difficult to kind of do that. These are the kind of mundane problems that I'm really trying to figure out how we could apply design thinking solutions to. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just not even the tip of the iceberg. But what I'm saying is that in our everyday engagement, as we kind of go through our life, there are so many things that require solving which haven't yet been addressed, either because people don't think they are important enough, or only a few people like me who are finicky about doing things in a certain way face the problem. So can design thinking help us solve some of these problems is the question that we need to ask ourselves. But we'll answer that question sometime later in the presentation today. But let me get started with what I want to share with you today. There are 2 simple things that I want to be able to talk about. One is to introduce the fundamentals of design thinking, and 2 is to kind of look at design thinking as an approach or as a process. And at this stage, it's important to really distinguish that design thinking is actually more about thinking than about design. In fact, it is more about the way designers think, because designers think slightly differently from the rest of us. Most of us, and surely in this group, follow a certain kind of a thinking process based on our upbringing, based on our education, which looks at what are the constraints around a given problem. So if you are given a problem, you start thinking about in how many ways is this problem constrained. Therefore, I need to find a solution within those constraints. Whereas designers, on the other hand, think about possibilities rather than constraints. So they don't really confine themselves to, let's say, constraints imposed by physics, constraints imposed by any of the materials and things like that. They just think about possibilities. And sometimes when they bring up these possibilities, and when several such things kind of come together, some of these possibilities turn into reality. And that is the difference in terms of how designers think versus how we think, or how the rest of the people think. And so what I want to emphasize here is, can we in some way think like the designers in order for us to be able to solve some of our problems? So that's the kind of tone that I'm going to take in this entire presentation. Now, the question that you might ask yourself is, why is design thinking something that is being touted as a solution for a lot of problems that we face today? One of the reasons is this: there's a lot of clutter in the market when it comes to products and services. It's tea time, so let's talk about biscuits. If I were to open a pack of Bourbon biscuit, probably a favorite category of biscuits, and I open 5 different packs from 5 different brands and keep them on a piece of, on a plate, it would be very difficult for people to figure out which is which. Likewise, for any other category of biscuits, whether it's Mari or whatever. So there is a lot of kind of anonymity in terms of the product once the wrapper is opened out. Bottled water. I mean, all of us want to drink bottled water when we are out because of the safety and other such considerations. But truly speaking, is there any distinctive difference between bottled water branded by various companies? And so if I were to just pour the water in glasses, would you be able to make a difference? And I can keep going on. An inverted door refrigerator, something that was a fancy thing about 3-4 years ago, but is now a commonplace kind of a product that you will see in retail outlets. Or any kind of sportswear or sports products from any of these brands. Even something as household as detergent. If I were to open these packs, some of them may have different colors, but other than that, there is really no way to tell the difference between them. So there's a lot of clutter in the market for a variety of products. So you might think that this is true for products, but it's also true for services. I can bet that many of you, at least those of you who are in India, would have both an Uber and an Ola app on your mobile phone, and would choose to use one of the two based on some considerations in terms of availability, in terms of maybe the fare that you're getting, or the kind of city that you're in where some of these services may or may not be available, and so on. But truly speaking, if you were to remove the labels from these apps, would you be able to figure out which is the Uber app and which is the Ola app, beyond the color schemes and things like that? Same thing about, let's say you're traveling a holiday and you want to go kind of book tickets and hotels and everything together and all of that. If you go to any of these websites, truly speaking, there is really no difference in terms of the way they serve their customers, on the way they kind of offer information or any other kind of fulfillment for their customers. And therefore, again, there is no distinction across these. And again, I can go on this. The recent darling of a lot of VCs and other things is this digital payment kind of systems. But again, if you have one and if you have any other, you will know that there is really no difference in the way they execute. So now, on one hand, we have clutter in the market as far as products and services are concerned. And therefore, if you want to introduce a new product or a new service in the market, how would you kind of do things differently? So that's one side of the story. And the other side of the story is, if I were to ask you about this particular picture in terms of who do you think recently sold this defense equipment to the British Navy? And ideally, in a session, I wait for responses to come from the audience. But here, I may not be able to do that, or I don't have the kind of access to the chat if at all someone is sending their answers. But maybe if you can think about it a little bit and imagine who might be the lead in terms of someone who recently was involved in selling this defense equipment to the British Navy. And many times when I use this example and I tell them that this is a defense equipment, so a lot of the defense companies come up and then a lot of other things come up. And then I tell them that the consortium that was formed was led by IBM. And actually, there is a little bit of a silence in the room at that time because they are not able to figure out what that is. And so the question, therefore, is, would a defense equipment contractor consider IBM as its competitor? Would you be able to think about why McDonnell Douglas, which is a defense contractor, should think about IBM also as a player in the entire defense business? And the reason we need to think about it from that perspective is today more than ever, we are really talking about an ecosystem play rather than individual companies competing with each other. And the reason probably IBM was invited as a lead in the consortia was because the value that this product delivered or was expected to deliver, particularly in the battlefield, was the biggest value or the most important value was in the technology that had gone into this equipment, whether it is communication technology, whether it is navigation, whether it is the ability to kind of steer clear of any danger, sense and respond to some of those dangers, etc. All of that technology was something that IBM had better understanding and better control of, and therefore IBM was invited as a lead in that consortium. So on one hand, there is a lot of clutter in the market. On the other, we don't even know who we are going to compete with. So in such circumstances, what are the avenues that are available for us to be able to create some kind of a differentiation, some kind of a distinction? And this is where I think one of the ways in which design thinking is being proposed as a solution for that. And that's why we are really talking about design thinking in this slide. Let me kind of move on quickly to what is design thinking. And if you really kind of do a quick search, you will come up with all of these phrases and terms when you type Google thinking. And in some ways, they are not wrong, but they still don't give us a clarity in terms of what this is all about. And therefore, what is important is, do we have a simple understanding of what design thinking is all about? Also, if you are really interested, if anyone is really interested in tracing the historical development of this entire concept, it's not something that has happened in the last 10 years or last 5 years, as someone would think. People have been talking about design thinking in the late 70s or early 70s, sorry. And since then, there have been efforts in terms of bringing in this notion of how designers think from the point of view of developing possibilities into both business as well as mainstream. And so over a period of time, companies like IDEO actually promoted design thinking as a unique way of identifying solutions and differentiating between them and the rest of the organizations. So Tim Brown, I think, is someone who is a very vocal kind of an advocate of design thinking. His article in the Harvard Business Review in 2008 was considered to be one of the most influential in terms of why design thinking became popular, at least as far as the boardroom was concerned. He essentially indicated that any design needs to qualify 3 criteria, and whatever goes through that criteria or whatever qualifies through that criteria becomes the most valuable design. The 3 criteria are desirability in terms of something that you create which is required or desired by the intended beneficiary. Feasibility in terms of, is it possible to do it, whether it is technological, whether it is material, whether it is anything else. And then viability in terms of business viability, in terms of why should a company do it or why should someone do it. And whenever there is a sweet spot of these three together, that would be considered as a most valuable design. This is the proposition that Tim Brown presented, and then he goes on to talk about a lot of the experiences that IDEO has had. Tim Brown was the CEO of IDEO, and so he cites a lot of experiences of how IDEO actually used this framework to create differentiating solutions. And so there's a lot that started from this understanding, but business people being business people wanted to kind of think about how they could learn this rather than just rely on a few people with ponytails to kind of do it. So this is where Stanford Design School actually brought in a process approach or a framework, if you will, to explain design thinking to constituents, which could be their executive education program participants or their B school students or whoever. And really, this is the kind of template, or this is the kind of framework that is now being used extensively in explaining what design thinking is all about and using design thinking as a mechanism for developing products, services, and solutions. I'll mention some of these in more detail as we go, but essentially it talks about 4 or 5 stages in terms of the thinking process or the approach, which starts with empathize, goes on to define, then looks at ideate, prototype, test and assess, test and assess sometimes taken together. But essentially the first 3 or 4 stages in terms of empathize, define, ideate and prototype are the distinctive kind of factors of what design thinking is all about. People have been collecting consumer feedback for ages, but design thinking is one of those tools which actually lets you involve the consumers right from the development of an idea into some kind of an offering. And the advancements in technology are making it far more easier to develop prototypes, which can then be handed over to the consumers for their feedback. And so these two, the ability to bring consumers into the development process right at an early stage, and the ability to develop prototypes which people can very easily provide feedback for, is something that are the characteristics of design thinking which are specific for this approach. Now, we can actually look at multiple approaches to design thinking, but simply put, design thinking is nothing but a human-centered, prototype-driven, iterative innovation process. And there are these 4 things that are mentioned here: human-centered, prototype-driven, iterative, and an innovation process. These are the distinctive characteristics of what a design thinking approach is all about. And we'll talk about some of these as we go in the subsequent slides. But here are some kind of deliverables or value additions that design thinking allows us to materialize. One is making things simple. And I think if you heard the set of problems that I mentioned at the beginning, you would know that these are not very difficult problems, but even then, even if you make better and better and better solutions, they still need simplification. And I think that is what a design thinking approach can help you with in terms of making things simple. Then there is the combination of aesthetics and functionality. And I think increasingly in many markets where there are extremely competitive products, people have reached a certain stage where quality is a given, features are a given, and now we are actually getting into the next order of competition, which is more on the aesthetics, more on the appearances, more on the kind of the way things are presented and packaged and so on and so forth. So design thinking allows you to kind of look at that aspect. Improving the quality of experience that someone would like to have, whether they are buying a product or experiencing a service. This is something that design thinking is allowing extensively. creating solutions, not just a product, but a product plus a paraphernalia of or a association of services that go along with the product. And increasingly, you will see that the product companies are coming up with services, and the service companies are coming up with products to complement the way the consumer perceives these offerings, whether they are products or services. And in some way, the ability to kind of imagine that is something that the designers are actually doing, which allow them to create some of those. And then, of course, there is the specific individualized needs of people. The one that you see here in front of you is essentially a mouse, as you would have guessed, but it is a mouse meant for people who are left-handed. Usually, the navigation, particularly if there's a trackball that you can see, is normally on the right side, or actually on the left side of the mouse, because the right-handed people can then use the thumb to use that trackball. But for the left-handed people, the trackball has been kept on the right-hand side. Now, this is just one of the kind of manifestations of the individualized needs. But even to the individual's requirements of, let's say, product or services that are more or less generic products or services, there is an opportunity for us to create personalization or individualization. So this is the kind of benefits or so-called value that design thinking can deliver. And if you really want to understand how you can do it yourself, here is a kind of a process flow in terms of how the steps in design thinking take place. Now, you might see them as linear in terms of going from observe to empathize to define, ideate, prototype, and execute, etc. But that's not necessarily the way things work. There's a lot of iteration. Remember the word iterative in the previous sentence. So there's a lot of iteration across all of these stages in terms of how things can either go back or go forward in their stages to be able to give us something meaningful to work with. So truly speaking, it's not necessarily a linear process. It's an iterative or sometimes even a circular process, which can be used for developing something new. Let me kind of move from here and look at a few things related with the steps that I have just mentioned. So one of the steps is observe. And the question is, or the statement is, observe your stakeholders in the natural environment and seek quality data over quantity. There is usually an exercise that I would do in the class, which I'm just going to flash, but I don't know whether we'll be able to get a response. But if one were to use this exercise in terms of, think about the image that you see and try and answer these 4 questions for yourselves. What do you observe? What do you understand and interpret? What needs can you identify? And what ideas can you generate? This is an exercise that actually allows us to think about things in a slightly different manner. Because when I give this exercise in the class, a lot of people start saying that there is an old person looking at a laptop. And I kind of let them keep going a little bit. And then I ask them, what gives you the indication that it's a laptop? And so that's when people start thinking about what are the assumptions that they are making when they look at something, and do those assumptions create biases that in some way prevent them from looking at things in terms of what the data is telling us. So many people tell me that this person is really concerned because something has happened on the laptop. And then I ask them, what gives you the indication that this person is concerned? And then they tell me about the facial expression and so on and so forth. So again, the ability to read those facial expression and figure out that there is concern comes from our understanding or our ability as human beings to read or see things. But it may not necessarily be the right thing at that point in time, because we need to keep our assumptions aside we need to keep our biases aside. Some people say that the laptop has conked off or the screen has conked off, and therefore this person is worried. Someone would say that he was looking at some kind of a medical report which is giving him some alarming signals and therefore he is worried. Some people might say that he's looking at his portfolio which probably has nosedived and therefore he's worried. Now, none of that is actually visible in the photograph. These are all interpretations that we are layering on top of each other based on what are the assumptions that we are making. So even in the observe, which is the basis of developing something unique, we need to be able to understand whether we see things or whether we imagine them. So there is a need for us to kind of keep our biases aside when we are observing something to be able to make sense of what are the struggles that someone is facing and so on and so forth. So this is as far as the observe part is concerned, which is the very interesting part in the stage. The next is something that is interesting, and here I'm going to play a video because it's a fascinating video that elaborates something. So take a look at this. I hope the audio is working all right.
No, so the audio is not working actually.
Not working? Okay. How do I do that? This is what I was saying,
Please,
that even if you try
please
it
go to
before,
options at the top. In the more you can see,
okay.
please go to more and click share system audio.
Where is the share system audio? Share sound. Let's see if it works. About now?
Yes, that's fine.
Uh, so whenever I play this video, I think I get good goosebumps all over again. But I think this is a question that you should ask yourself. If you could feel other people's pain, if you could see what they see, hear what they hear, would you treat them differently? In this case, the this whole kind of video is taken from the Mayo Clinic's advertisement. So treat them differently has a different meaning there, but treat them differently would also be, can we engage with them differently as well? And this is the kind of question, or this is the kind of point about how designers think differently or work differently, is in terms of building an empathy for either the problem or the people who face the problem. So I think empathizing is one of the key ingredients of design thinking. And one way to really empathize is to really be able to feel the kind of concern or pain, that someone is facing yourself. The picture that you see here is someone who's wearing a pair of gloves which prevent their hands or their fingers actually moving freely, to really understand what someone who has arthritis might actually be experiencing when they do day-to-day things such as peeling an orange. So I think this is probably one of the single most important stage in the design thinking approach, which is critical in terms of helping us do things differently. I think this helps us to understand or develop a deeper understanding of the problems that people are facing. And I think a common phrase that gets used is when people talk about empathy, people talk about getting into someone's shoes and walking a mile, or walking in someone's shoes for a distance. And so at this stage, the question therefore is, can you really get into someone else's shoes without taking off your own? This is all about the ability to understand what are the assumptions, prejudices, or biases that I have, and how to keep that aside when we are trying to empathize with someone, to not let things color in terms of how we see things, how we feel things, how we hear things, and so on and so forth. So this is the single most important stage in that entire design thinking approach, in terms of how do you empathize. Of course, for each of these, there are several tools or toolkits that have been developed by various researchers and experts for allowing people to look at things such as empathy. For example, there is something called as an empathy map that one can create. And if there was time, we would have explained that in more detail. But there are tools that are available that allow people to become better in terms of empathizing with others. So that's the observe and the empathize stage. We then come to the define stage, where you're trying to define the problem that someone is trying to solve. Now, this is important because sometimes the definition of a problem as someone articulates it is not necessarily the problem that they are solving. It is something that they're doing which they're getting troubled with, and therefore they think that that is the problem that they need to be solving. And oftentimes the exploration of why are you really trying to do this? So the 5 why approach, if you've heard of it, really helps us to get to the deep-rooted problem that someone is trying to solve. And when you do that, it's easier for someone to be able to come up with a solution for that problem. So again, there are tools that you can use for kind of coming up with variety of problem statements, identifying some challenges that are unarticulated. Sometimes people may not know what really they are trying to achieve or do, and therefore that's something that can be discovered, and so on and so forth. The next stage is ideation stage, and I think that this most experts suggest that when you're ideating, think without hesitation, think without any constraint, and do not worry whether the ideas are practical or feasible at this point in time. Like the visual says, this is Linus Pauling, a 2-time Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. The best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas. And it has been proven that sometimes through some very strange and sometimes very funny appearing ideas, when combined together, actually lead to something very novel, very interesting. So again, ideation is one stage which has been kind of around for a long time in terms of new product development, but there is a different kind of an approach that you can take in the design thinking process in ideation also. Again, there are several ideation tools that are available out there. Each of them can be discussed independently as a session in itself, and one doesn't really have the time to do that. So it's something that you probably have to kind of experience and figure out which one of them is the most important thing for you. The next stage is, of course, prototyping, and the importance of prototyping is underscored by the fact that until this stage, everything is in someone's mind. So whether you're ideating, whether you're defining the problem, whether you're figuring out why something is happening or why something is not happening, all of this, that is essentially cerebral. It is happening in the head. This is the first stage. Prototyping is the first stage where these ideas get translated into something that people can actually engage with. And therefore, that is the kind of importance of this, where thinking with your hands is what this stage is called. And it allows basically the creators of something to explore feedback from the intended users or beneficiaries. Oftentimes, prototypes are created with a view of collecting feedback in terms of what is working, what is not working, what can be improved, what needs to be dropped, and so on and so forth. But there is a little bit of a caveat here that the more engaged someone gets with a prototype, the less likely that they are to take the feedback and really start working all over again. You may get engaged so much that you might think that people don't really understand what this is all about, and therefore you may discount the feedback that you are getting. So this escalation of commitment, so to say, with a prototype is something that should be avoided at this stage, because there is a specific objective, specific intention of creating prototypes, which is getting feedback. Once there is enough feedback that's available from these prototypes, you can actually come up with the final solution. For example, if this is an experience that you want to offer as a solution or as a kind of a service to someone, maybe there are ways in which you can prototype by looking at something like this. Now, if let's assume that this is the solution that you want to offer someone, what would be the prototype? Then you need to kind of go to the next level where you observe things that are happening in the environment around us, where there are children playing on trees and piles of heaps of whatever rubbish and tires and whatnot. And what do they do when they are trying to kind of enjoy themselves? Those could become the prototypes that you would need to work with. So those are things that are entailed in the prototype part. Prototypes, as you probably have heard of this term, and therefore you will have seen all kinds of things being used for prototypes. With 3D printing, it's now becoming even easier in terms, or even more economical in terms of creating almost a real life kind of a prototype if possible. But essentially, prototypes use things that are, in most cases, material that can be very easily discarded or thrown away just to get to the next stage of getting feedback. Once you have that, once you've arrived at some kind of a finalized version of the prototype, you can take it for some kind of a market testing and then collect more feedback in terms of a real product. Then there are various ways in which real products are introduced in the market, whether it is depending on the format of the product or the service. In the web sphere, there is an A and A/B testing that gets done. In actual product launches, there are pilot launches that get done in different cities with different variants and different kind of formats of the product to test out the feedback. And then finally, something is changed and something is kind of improvised. But this is the kind of stage where the product is now near ready for its market presentation. But the story is not over yet, because at this stage, you have got something which is probably a little different from what is existing in the market. And therefore, this is where the ability to really communicate that distinction comes into picture. And the storytelling as a technique or a storytelling as a characteristic is something that designers are able to employ here, where they are able to create a scenario, create a picture, create a visualization of what might happen when you use something. And basically, that's where the enticement or the willingness for the people to really experiment with a product happens. Then, of course, there is a subsequent stage where you need to get into a business plan and so on and so forth, etc., etc. So this is the kind of process end to end as far as the design thinking process is concerned. I'm going to take a pause here and check on time, and we still have good time. So I will allow questions or of any kind at this stage. If people want to write those questions down or request for unmuting and ask those questions, that's fine. Because there are a couple of other things that I want to give it to you before we close for the thing today. But at this stage, if there are any questions, please feel free. I'm sharing with you some resources that might be useful because I know that I have really rushed through this entire thing. So here are a set of books that you can go and read. All of them. This is again a very short list. There are many books that are available out there, but here are some that are very interesting. They give you a lot of insight as well as case studies and applications of design thinking. Then there is, of course, a rich treasure trove of videos, both on YouTube as well as on TED Talks, which illustrate some of the other elements in design thinking, whether it is empathize, whether it is prototyping, whether it is observations. There is also listening involved in all of that. So there's a lot that's available for you to be able to go through in order for you to get better understanding of design thinking. Now, having kind of gone through this process, if we were to come back to some of the things that we were discussing earlier, for example, if I am an elevator, if I'm standing in front of an elevator and don't really know which way, which button I should press to go in a certain direction, what is it that can be done? There are different things that can be done. Most of us tend to think about what product changes can I make, right? And oftentimes the products are not a problem. In fact, there's a fantastic case study. If anyone was interested, I would have probably, if we had time, I would have probably gone through that, about an experience that GE had with its CT scanning machine in terms of how they faced a challenge and how they kind of worked around it. But really speaking, sometimes the problems are not essentially in the products themselves, but how the products interact or engage with the consumers. And in some cases, there might be some education that might be required in terms of helping consumers to understand how they could actually use those products and figure out a way to kind of get the most out of the products and services. Today, it is increasingly possible with videos and other such mechanisms that are freely available to help a customer get to understand how to do something right there when they are trying to do it. And things such as QR codes and so on and so forth can allow you to quickly use demonstrations and several other things that are probably useful. So I think in terms of solving day-to-day problems, the crux is essentially in really understanding why someone is doing what they're doing. And if we can figure that out, if through observation, because if you ask people whether they want something or not, they will not always be able to tell you yes or no. But if you present something to them and say, here is what I have created for you to solve a particular problem, then they are more likely to say, yes, this will solve my problem, or no, this will not solve my problem, or yes, this will solve my problem, but I also need something else, or maybe if you change this, it will solve my problem, and things like that. it's easier for most of us to give feedback on something that I can visualize or engage with. It's very difficult for us to give feedback on something that might be considered imaginary. And so one of the things that's important from design thinking perspective is when you're trying to solve the problem, you should ask yourself, is that the problem that needs solving? Or is there something more, something different that probably needs to be addressed? Whether it's the kind of elevator button, or whether it is the colors of buttons on a website, or whether it is how to open a milk pouch at a hotel, and so on and so forth. I mean, you can go on and on about the kind of challenges that people are still facing. Have you ever tried to open a packet of chips? I I was once informed or once told a story about someone who had gone someplace along with his girlfriend in trying to open the packet of chips, and the entire packet kind of exploded, and the chips fell all over both of them, and they made a kind of scene for themselves. Things like that still require some way of looking at what is it that people are doing and how can we help them do things in a certain manner which reduces their pain in some way, avoids some of the anxieties that they might be facing. And really speaking, I've talked about very mundane things, but you can actually do a lot with a lot of other things. I recently had a couple of experiences with variety of financial services where I would definitely have benefited from someone telling me things to do in a certain manner rather than me trying to do it on my own. And so that's where we are at. But I'll shut up here and I'll open it for any questions or any comments or any points that you would like to discuss.
Thank you, Dr. Ajay. I'm audible here?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Yeah, there are a few questions, so I'll just ask them here on behalf of the participants.
Sure.
So there's a question from Sanjay. Are there measurement tools for design that allows one to know if one has sufficiently evolved in the design?
The simple answer is yes. There are enough matrices that are available to assess design. But I think more than assessing design, what is important is, are we able to assess how the design delivers a certain value? And I think that is difficult because even if you have created some kind of a universal design, there will still be outliers who may not be able to work with that design as effectively as it is expected. So the long answer is, yes, there are matrices available for assessing design, but instead of assessing design, we should assess how that design creates value for a majority of customers or majority of users and beneficiaries rather than for a very few.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Another question is from Nitesh. How to standardize any process for product design if very less data is available from the previous designs?
Excellent question. The simple answer is standardization is the death of design thinking. Okay. The whole idea about design thinking is, can we look at exceptions that are happening where people who do not fall in that standard still require a solution, still require an answer to their problem and are unable to do it. And therefore, we cannot give them the same standard solution. The standardization needs to be in the development of something rather than the solution itself. So you can do the standardization of how might we be able to collect feedback from consumers or users or beneficiaries when a prototype is shared with them to be able to understand the best way to collect things that they would like to say, which sometimes they're unable to say. So are there methods that are available to get feedback from users about things that they would like but are unable to state. Is there some kind of a unstated need that is not getting fulfilled? So you can create standardizations around that. But to standardize a product or a process to where there is not much data available would be directly in conflict of the approach to design thinking. In fact, the thought process in design thinking is the moment we think about the fact that here is the data that gives us information about the larger set of people, the so-called segments of consumers. The moment we'll start looking at segment data, we lose out on the finer aspects of what are the nuances that people in that consumer segment themselves may be requiring differently, which may not be necessarily doing the product differently or delivering the service differently, but some aspect of the service, which could be communication, which could be packaging, which could be presentation, which could be education, any of that associated services or associated characteristics which are required to be done differently gets lost in that aggregation. And therefore, it might sometimes be useful to collect more qualitative information, qualitative data from what are called as extreme users to just understand how does someone use it to its hilt and how does someone does not use it at all for whatever reasons. And oftentimes the design thinking principles use this as the basis of building product, services, and solutions, rather than looking at generic or mass data to do any projection or analysis.
Thank you, Roger. Another interesting question is, can commercial success be one best metric for a good design from somebody?
Can commercial success be one best method for a good design? Slightly confusing question, but commercial success doesn't always mean good design. If that's the kind of question. Oftentimes, commercial success may happen just because of lack of any other alternative available in the marketplace. In areas or in sectors where there is a very high level of competition, design tends to become something of a differentiator, and oftentimes it takes on the form of adding premium in the overall kind of differentiation in the marketplace. And therefore, oftentimes design is perceived as something that gets associated with high priced or premium or very, very high ticket value kind of offerings, whether they're products or services. But in the absence of a highly competitive marketplace, even something incremental can become a commercial success.
Thank you, Roger. I think we have run out of time. There are many other questions, but as I said in the beginning, we will download the transcript and we will request you for answers offline. So I think we can stop here.
Just in case anyone wants to reach out, these are my coordinates. I'll be happy to discuss more if anyone is interested. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Dr. Ajay, for a very informative session. I'm sure participants would have got a very good insight into the design thinking and probably interest to explore further on that. And thanks again on behalf of all the participants, Dr. Ajay, and also on the behalf of IIT Bombay Alumni Association.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Will I log off now?
Thank you all. Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you all.